The night was still, yet the German shepherd growled, eyes locked on the nursery door. Every night, the same eerie warning. The millionaire couple dismissed it, until they discovered why. Their world shattered in an instant, and the horror began. The sprawling estate of the Holloways was a fortress of wealth, security, and silence. Nestled on the outskirts of New Hampshire, their mansion stood like an isolated kingdom, surrounded by acres of dense woodland. Every inch of the property was pristine, except for the deep, guttural growl that echoed through the halls every night. Brutus, the family's German shepherd, had never been an aggressive dog. Loyal, intelligent, and trained to protect, he had been a gift to their son, Oliver, on his 5th birthday. For years, Brutus was more than just a pet. He was Oliver's shadow, a guardian against every imagined monster hiding under the bed. But something changed. It started subtly, his ears perking up at odd hours, his body tense as he stood watch outside Oliver's nursery door. Then came the growls, low and deliberate, growing more insistent with each passing night. At first, Daniel and Claire Holloway brushed it off. Maybe he hears animals outside, Claire had reasoned. Foxes, raccoons, he's just being protective. But the unease lingered. One night, Claire woke to find Brutus standing in the hallway, his stance rigid, his hackles raised. His gaze was locked on the nursery door, lips curled just enough to reveal his teeth. The sight sent an involuntary shiver through her spine. She glanced at the baby monitor. Oliver was sound asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling in the rhythmic peace of childhood. Still, Brutus didn't move. Claire tried to coax him away, but he remained planted like a sentry. When she reached for the doorknob, a low growl rumbled in his throat. That was when she knew. Brutus wasn't looking outside the nursery. He was staring at it. That night, Claire barely slept. The once comforting creaks of their home suddenly felt ominous, the distant hum of the security system like a whisper of warning. By morning, she convinced herself it was exhaustion playing tricks on her. Oliver was fine. The house was locked up. Brutus was just being overprotective. She didn't know then that this was only the beginning. The following night, Daniel returned home late from work, his tie loosened, his mind preoccupied with stock markets and quarterly reports. He barely registered Claire's anxious expression until she muttered, "It happened again." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Claire, dogs react to things we don't notice. Maybe a shadow from the hallway, maybe—" "Daniel?" He growled at me when I tried to open the door. That caught his attention. Daniel was a man of logic, a believer in things he could see and quantify. He followed Claire up the grand staircase, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. Brutus was already there, sitting in front of Oliver's nursery, his tail motionless, his amber eyes locked on the door like a soldier waiting for an unseen enemy. Daniel knelt beside the dog. "Hey, buddy, what is it?" He reached out a hand, brushing it against Brutus's fur. The dog didn't flinch, didn't blink. A sudden, involuntary chill crawled up Daniel's spine. Something about the silence felt wrong. Taking a breath, he pushed the door open. The nursery was bathed in the soft glow of a nightlight, its walls painted in gentle shades of blue. Plush toys lined the shelves. The baby monitor's red light blinked steadily. Everything was normal. And yet, it wasn't. Daniel's gaze swept the room, his mind racing. The windows were locked. The closet door was shut. Oliver was fast asleep in his crib, his small fingers curled around his favorite stuffed bear. Then Brutus stepped forward. The growl returned, soft but unmistakable, vibrating through the quiet room like an unspoken warning. He wasn't looking at Oliver. He wasn't even looking at the door. His gaze was fixed on the empty corner of the room, a place where no one stood, a place that, for some reason, felt unbearably cold. Claire's breath hitched beside Daniel. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. The air had shifted. The nursery, once warm and safe, now felt different, heavier, as if something unseen had pressed itself into the very fabric of the room. Daniel swallowed, forcing a chuckle. It's probably just a draft. But even as he said it, he couldn't ignore the gnawing sensation in his chest. As they turned off the light and left the room, Brutus hesitated before following. His head remained turned, his eyes lingering on that same empty corner. Daniel shut the door behind them. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them knew that this was only the first sign. Something was watching. Something that didn't belong. The next few nights followed the same eerie pattern. Midnight would creep in, and with it, the low, warning growl of Brutus. Every night, he planted himself in front of Oliver's nursery door like an immovable force. His body tense, his eyes fixed on something unseen. Claire and Daniel tried everything. They kept the lights on. They played soft music. They even moved Brutus's bed downstairs. But the moment the clock struck 12, he would pace the hall until he was back in his spot, his deep rumble vibrating through the house like an unspoken alarm. Daniel, still reluctant to admit anything was wrong, called an animal behaviorist. The man arrived with a clipboard and an air of certainty, his voice brimming with the confidence of someone who had seen it all. He asked routine questions, examined Brutus, and checked the house for anything that might be triggering the dog's reaction. Rodents, strange noises, unfamiliar scents. Nothing. Well, the behaviorist finally said, scribbling a note. Sometimes dogs fixate on things. A shadow, a movement they can't quite place. It's an instinct to protect. If you reinforce calm behavior and discourage the fixation, it should pass. Discourage how? Claire asked, her arms folded. Keep him away from the room when he starts acting up. Show him there's nothing to fear. It sounded reasonable, rational, logical, but it didn't work. That night, when Brutus once again planted himself in front of Oliver's door, Daniel decided to take charge. He grabbed the dog's collar, gently but firmly pulling him away. Brutus, enough, go lie down. Brutus resisted. His body stiffened. His growl deepened, vibrating beneath Daniel's grip. Brutus, he repeated, forcing authority into his voice. Go downstairs. Then, for the first time in his life, Brutus snapped. Not a full bite, just a warning. His teeth grazed Daniel's hand before he recoiled, instantly guilty, his ears flattening, his body cowering as if he hadn't meant to do it. Claire gasped. Oh my God, Daniel! Daniel stared at his hand. The skin wasn't broken, but the message was clear. Brutus, the dog they had raised and trusted for years, had never once shown aggression, but something had pushed him past his limits. Get him downstairs, Daniel muttered, his voice tight. Claire hesitated, then grabbed Brutus's collar, leading him away with soft reassurances. Come on, baby. It's okay. But Brutus fought every step, and as he was pulled away, he let out one last growl, not at them, but at the door, at whatever was inside. The tension thickened in the days that followed. Claire was the first to notice the other signs. Oliver began waking up at odd hours, crying inconsolably. She would rush in to find him sitting up in his crib, his tiny hands gripping the rails, staring at the same corner Brutus had fixated on. The air always felt colder when she entered. The baby monitor crackled with static some nights, faint whispers threading through the white noise. The rocking chair in the nursery, the one Claire swore she always left still, would sometimes be found swaying ever so slightly. Then came the giggles. Software faint. Just before dawn, when the world was still heavy with sleep. At first, Claire thought it was Oliver. A sleepy dream, maybe. But one morning, as she entered the room, she realized Oliver wasn't laughing. He was staring. At the corner. The empty corner. A chill crawled up her spine. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Claire didn't tell Daniel right away. She knew how he would react, rationalizing, dismissing, explaining it away as overactive imagination. Instead, she did something she had never done before. She called a priest. She wasn't particularly religious, but her mother had been. And right now, Claire needed someone who wouldn't look at her like she was insane. Father Matthews arrived that evening, a man in his 60s with tired eyes and a warm, steady presence. He listened carefully as Claire explained what had been happening: the growling, the cold air, the nursery's unsettling energy. "I'm not saying it's anything supernatural," Claire hesitated, "but something's wrong in that room." Father Matthews nodded, as if he had heard this kind of thing before. "Sometimes places carry energy," he said gently, "a residual presence or something more aware." Claire's stomach tightened. "Would you mind if I blessed the house?" the priest asked. She shook her head quickly. "No, please, whatever it takes." Together, they moved through each room, Father Matthews murmuring prayers, pressing a cross against the walls. When they reached Oliver's nursery, Brutus, who had been lying by the stairs, unusually quiet, suddenly sprang up. He let out a growl so deep, so guttural, it rattled through the floor. Then came the sound, a loud bang from inside the nursery. Claire's heart jumped into her throat. She yanked the door open. Nothing. The room was still, peaceful, except for the closet door, which was now slightly open. Claire swallowed hard. That wasn't open before. Father Matthews stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He approached the closet, hand hovering over it for a moment, then gently pulled the door open. Claire's breath caught. There were scratches inside, long, jagged marks trailing along the wood. Not from mice, not from Oliver, from something else. Father Matthews traced the marks with his fingers, exhaling softly. This house needs more than a blessing. That night, Claire finally told Daniel everything: the giggling, the rocking chair, the whispers through the baby monitor. Daniel, predictably, tried to explain it away. Old houses settle, wood contracts, sound carries. "Daniel, the closet scratched itself?" He hesitated, his face pale. Then, just as he was about to respond, the baby monitor crackled to life. Static. Then a faint, soft voice. "Mommy." Claire froze. Oliver was asleep in her arms. The monitor was picking up something. Or someone. Daniel bolted upstairs, throwing open the nursery door, his breath heavy. He flicked on the light. Nothing. The crib was empty. He spun, panic rising, until he saw Claire standing in the doorway, Oliver safe in her arms. Daniel exhaled sharply, pressing a hand to his forehead. This doesn't make sense. Then, from the baby monitor still clutched in Claire's hand, a faint, mirthful giggle. The house was no longer a home. It was a breathing, watching thing, filled with something unseen yet undeniably present. Daniel tried to rationalize, but even he could no longer ignore the signs. The baby monitor picking up voices, the sudden chill in the nursery, the scratches in the closet, Brutus's unwavering vigilance. It was as though something had shifted, as though they had disturbed something that had been lying in wait. Claire barely slept anymore. She lay awake, listening to the creaks in the hallway, to the occasional scrape against the walls, to the unnatural quiet that pressed in around them. And then, one night, something changed. It was just past midnight when Claire jolted awake, heart pounding. She hadn't heard anything, but the air was wrong. Thick, charged. It was the kind of silence that made her stomach twist with instinctual fear. She reached for Daniel, but the bed beside her was empty. Panic surged. She threw the blankets off and rushed into the hallway, nearly tripping over Brutus, who was already there, his body taut, his teeth bared. A whisper floated through the air. Not from the baby monitor. Not from Oliver's room. From down the hall. From inside the closet. Claire's breath hitched. The closet door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness splitting the wall. Then, a creak. The door inched open. Slowly, Brutus let out a snarl, lunging forward just as something moved within the darkness. Claire screamed. Daniel appeared, wild-eyed, grabbing her by the shoulders. "What? What is it?" She pointed with a shaking hand. "The closet something." But the door was shut. No sign of movement. No sound at all. Brutus, still growling, paced back and forth in front of it. Daniel stepped forward, his face set, his fingers curling into fists. Then the baby monitor crackled. A whisper. "Mommy, why won't you help me?" Oliver's cry ripped through the house. Claire and Daniel bolted for the nursery. Inside, Oliver was thrashing in his crib, his tiny body twisting as if struggling against something unseen. His face was contorted, his hands clawing at the air. Brutus pushed past them, jumping onto his hind legs, barking at nothing. Claire grabbed Oliver, clutching him against her chest, her pulse roaring in her ears. Daniel spun, his back against them, his voice shaking. "We're leaving, right now." They drove in silence, the weight of what had just happened pressing against them like a suffocating fog. The road stretched ahead, empty and dark, the headlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Claire clutched Oliver to her chest, her heartbeat hammering against his small frame. His words echoed in her mind. "He just wants to go home." Daniel's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap. "Where are we going?" Claire finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A hotel. Somewhere anywhere but there," Daniel muttered. Claire swallowed hard. She wanted to believe leaving would fix this, that they could put miles between themselves and whatever had taken root in their home. But deep down, a sick feeling twisted inside her. Would it even matter? Brutus sat in the back seat beside Oliver, his body tense, his ears flicking at every sound. He hadn't stopped growling not since they left. His gaze remained locked on Oliver, watching him as though he expected something to happen, as though he knew something they didn't. They pulled into a small roadside motel an hour later. It was the kind of place that smelled of stale air and cheap detergent, with flickering neon signs that barely held onto their glow. Daniel booked a room while Claire sat in the car, unwilling to step out into the cold night. Oliver stirred in her arms, his tiny fingers curling around the fabric of her sweater. "Mommy?" His voice was thick with sleep. Claire kissed his forehead. "It's okay, baby, we're okay." But she wasn't sure if that was true. Inside the room, they locked the door, shoved a chair beneath the handle, and pulled the curtains shut. Daniel paced. Claire sat on the bed, rocking Oliver, her eyes darting to Brutus every time he let out a quiet whine. Finally, Daniel stopped pacing and turned to her. "We need help." Claire met his gaze. "I called a priest. It didn't do anything." Daniel shook his head. "Not a priest, a professional, someone who understands this kind of thing." Claire hesitated. The idea of reaching out to a paranormal expert made her feel ridiculous, like she was admitting defeat to something that shouldn't exist. But at this point, what choice did they have? "Do you know anyone?" she asked, her voice tight. Daniel exhaled. "No, but I'll find someone." He pulled out his phone and started searching. Claire lay Oliver down on the bed beside her, brushing his curls away from his forehead. His breathing was slow, steady. Then, softly, he giggled. Claire froze. She turned her head slowly, her pulse pounding. Oliver's eyes were still closed. The giggle wasn't his. Claire's breath came in short gasps. She reached for Oliver, shaking him gently. "Baby, wake up." Oliver's eyes fluttered open. He looked at her, sleepy and confused. "Mommy?" A loud thud came from the ceiling. Daniel jerked his head up. Claire's fingers dug into Oliver's shirt. Another thud. The sound of footsteps. But they were on the top floor. There was no room above them. Daniel grabbed the motel phone, his voice shaking as he spoke to the front desk. "Is someone in the room above us?" A pause. Then the receptionist's voice, confused. "Sir, you're in the highest room. There's nothing up there." The footsteps continued. Brutus let out a snarl, his ears pinned back. Then Oliver whispered, "He found us." The lights flickered. The air in the room turned ice cold. Claire clutched Oliver and scrambled off the bed. Daniel grabbed her arm, his own face pale with terror. The footsteps moved. From the ceiling to the walls. A scraping sound ran along the motel room's wallpaper, slow and deliberate, as if something were dragging its nails across the surface. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. Only the heavy sound of their own breathing remained. Claire's legs trembled beneath her. Daniel swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "We're leaving, now." They grabbed what little they had, wrapped Oliver in a blanket, and bolted from the room. Brutus was the first out the door, his tail stiff, his ears flat. The motel clerk watched them with wide eyes as they rushed past the front desk. "Everything okay?" he called after them. Daniel didn't answer. They drove through the night, the highway stretching endlessly ahead of them. Neither spoke. It didn't matter where they went. They knew now. This thing wasn't in their house. It was with them. And it wasn't letting go. The road stretched ahead, an endless black ribbon under the cold glare of the headlights. The night felt heavier than before, pressing in on them, suffocating in its silence. The world outside was still too still. Not even the trees swayed in the wind. Claire sat in the back seat, cradling Oliver against her chest, her hands gripping him so tightly that her knuckles ached. Brutus lay beside them, his ears alert, his body stiff, as if expecting something to happen at any moment. Daniel's hands trembled against the wheel. He hadn't spoken in miles, his jaw locked tight, his face pale. He kept checking the rearview mirror, his breath shallow, as if he expected to see something staring back. "We can't keep running," Claire finally whispered. Daniel didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the road, but his knuckles tightened. "I don't know what else to do." Claire swallowed. "Daniel, it followed us." Daniel's grip on the wheel faltered for just a second, the car swerving slightly before he steadied it. "Don't say that. Tell me I'm wrong." Daniel didn't answer. Claire closed her eyes, pressing her lips against Oliver's hair. He was sleeping, but his breathing was uneven, his small fingers twitching every now and then as if he were dreaming or trapped in something worse. Then he whispered in his sleep, "He doesn't want you here." Claire's stomach twisted. She pulled back, brushing his hair from his forehead. "Baby," she whispered. Oliver's eyelids fluttered, but he didn't wake. His lips parted slightly, and his breath came out in slow, measured words. "He said you shouldn't have come." Claire's skin prickled. The temperature inside the car plummeted. Brutus let out a low, warning growl. Then, the backseat door unlocked. The sharp click shattered the silence like a gunshot. Claire let out a strangled gasp and lunged for the door, slamming the lock back down. Daniel slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched against the empty road as the car skidded to a violent stop. "What the hell was that?" Daniel shouted, his voice ragged, his breaths uneven. Claire was shaking, her heart slamming against her ribs. The door it just unlocked by itself. Daniel twisted in his seat, reaching back, his eyes wide with panic. "Are you sure?" Before Claire could answer, Oliver stirred. His eyes fluttered open blank, glassy. Then, in a voice that wasn't his, he whispered, "He's in the car." Brutus lunged forward, snapping at empty air. Claire screamed. Daniel threw the car into drive, pressing the gas pedal so hard the tires burned against the pavement. They sped down the road, the trees blurring past them, the wind howling through the cracks in the windows. Claire turned, her breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts, her hands shaking. She reached for Oliver, trying to wake him fully. His lips moved again. "He's so cold." Daniel's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and his breath hitched. Claire saw it the second he did. A reflection. Not of them, not of Oliver. Something else sitting in the back seat. A shadow, twisted and shifting, smiling. Daniel let out a strangled cry and slammed the mirror upward so hard it nearly snapped off. "No, no, no, no!" The car's engine roared. Oliver gasped, his small body jerking forward. His pupils were blown wide, and his fingers clutched at Claire's shirt as he sucked in a breath like something had just let him go. Brutus whimpered and collapsed against the seat, his body trembling. Then, silence. The car tore down the highway, but the presence was gone. Or at least it had retreated. Claire's hands were shaking violently as she pulled Oliver closer, kissing his forehead over and over. He was awake now, his breath rapid, confused, his small voice trembling. "Mommy?" Claire choked on a sob. "I'm here, baby, I'm here." Daniel didn't stop driving. He didn't say a word. They were not going back. They were not staying anywhere. Because now they knew. This wasn't just about the house. It wasn't just about Oliver. It was about them. They had been chosen. And whatever it was never going to let them go. Daniel didn't stop driving until the first slivers of dawn cracked over the horizon. The road stretched endlessly ahead, a ghostly silver under the early morning light. The events of the night clung to them like cold sweat, thick and suffocating. Claire hadn't let go of Oliver. His small body was curled against her chest, his breathing steady but shallow. She hadn't dared to close her eyes, afraid that if she blinked, something would pull him away. Brutus lay beside them in the back seat, his head resting against Claire's lap. He wasn't sleeping, his body remained stiff, his ears twitching at every faint noise. He was waiting. For what? Claire didn't know. Daniel's hands were tight on the wheel, his knuckles white. He hadn't spoken since they left the motel. Not a single word. But Claire could feel the tremor in his limbs, see the way his eyes flicked too often to the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see that thing sitting in the back seat again. They had driven all night, the fear urging them forward. But now, as the sun rose, the exhaustion settled into their bones. Daniel finally broke the silence. "We need help." Claire swallowed. "From who?" Daniel's jaw clenched. "I found someone, a man. He helps with things like this." Claire turned to him sharply. "You believe me now?" Daniel exhaled heavily. "Claire, I saw it, in the mirror. He shook his head, gripping the wheel harder. "I don't know what's happening, but we can't pretend it's nothing anymore." Claire released a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Where do we find him?" Daniel didn't answer right away. His fingers tapped against the steering wheel before he finally said, "We're already on our way." Claire frowned, glancing at the GPS. The screen showed a single destination: Jonathan Mercer, paranormal investigator. She had never believed in people like that, psychics, demonologists, ghost hunters. But after everything they had seen, everything they had heard, she was willing to believe in anything if it meant saving their son. Oliver stirred in her arms. "Mommy." Claire brushed his hair back. "I'm here, baby." Oliver's brows pinched together, his lips parting like he was trying to say something. Then his body jerked. His eyes snapped open wide. Wrong. His pupils were completely black. Claire gasped, her grip tightening on him. "Oliver?" His lips curled into something that wasn't a smile. Then, in a voice that wasn't his, he whispered, "You can't stop it." Brutus shot up, barking wildly. Oliver's body suddenly went limp. Claire screamed. Daniel swerved the car off the road, tires screeching as they skidded to a stop on the gravel shoulder. He threw off his seatbelt, turning in his seat. What happened? Claire was shaking so hard as she pressed her fingers to Oliver's face. He was unconscious, his body eerily still, his breath shallow. Then, just as suddenly, he gasped and blinked up at her. His eyes were normal again. "Mommy?" His voice was soft, innocent. Claire choked back a sob. "Baby?" Oliver looked around, confused. "Where are we?" Claire swallowed the bile rising in her throat. "It's okay. You're okay." But she wasn't, because something else had spoken through him. And it had promised that this wasn't over. They arrived at the old house just past noon. Jonathan Mercer's home was nothing like Claire had expected. It wasn't eerie or filled with strange symbols or lined with dusty books. It was a simple, modest house nestled deep in the countryside, surrounded by towering oaks. But despite its normal appearance, Claire felt something the moment they pulled into the driveway. The air here was different, heavy, but not in the way it had been before. There was something protective about it, as if an invisible barrier wrapped around the land, keeping the darkness at bay. Daniel killed the engine. No one moved. Then the front door of the house creaked open. A man stepped out. He was tall, in his late 50s, with silver-streaked hair and deep-set eyes that looked like they had seen too much. His presence wasn't intimidating, but it held a quiet authority, like someone who had fought monsters and survived. Jonathan Mercer. Daniel took a breath and opened the door first. Claire followed, holding Oliver tightly against her chest, Brutus sticking to her side like a second shadow. Mercer studied them, his sharp gaze scanning over them before landing on Oliver. "He's marked," Mercer said. Claire flinched. "What does that mean?" Mercer stepped forward, lowering his voice. "It means you don't have much time." Claire's arms tightened around Oliver. "Please," she whispered, "tell us how to stop this." Mercer exhaled and nodded toward the house. "Come inside." They followed him through the doorway, into a dimly lit study. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with ancient texts and journals. Candles flickered softly, their flames unmoving despite the lack of wind. Mercer gestured to the couch. Sit. Claire and Daniel sank down. Oliver nestled between them. Brutus refused to sit. He stood in front of them, his eyes locked on Mercer, unblinking. Mercer studied Oliver for a long moment. Then he reached into a drawer and pulled out an old, tattered book. He flipped through the pages before stopping on one and turning it toward them. The illustration made Claire's blood run cold. A shadow figure, featureless, twisted, hollow-eyed. It stood behind a child, its hands resting on their shoulders. Marked. Entities like this don't haunt houses, Mercer said. They haunt people. Daniel's breath came out unsteady. So we could have left the house 100 times, and it wouldn't have mattered? Mercer nodded. Once it chooses someone, it doesn't let go. Claire gripped Oliver's hand. How do we stop it? Mercer was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You need to know what it wants. Claire's stomach twisted. It wants Oliver. No, Mercer corrected. It doesn't just take people, it bargains. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. A deal? Mercer nodded. Somewhere, sometime, someone in your family line made a deal. And now, the debt is being collected. Claire felt like the air had been punched from her lungs. No, she whispered. No, that can't be. Oliver suddenly jerked forward. His eyes rolled back. His mouth fell open. Then, the candles flickered out. A deep, guttural voice filled the room. The deal was made. The boy is mine. Claire screamed, wrapping herself around Oliver as Daniel lunged forward, grabbing his son. Brutus snarled, barking furiously. Mercer moved fast, grabbing something from the tabla, small vial of dark liquid. He flicked the cork off and poured it in a circle around them, murmuring in a language Claire didn't recognize. The shadows in the room twisted, writhed, crept closer. Then Mercer's voice boomed. You are not welcome here. The shadows shattered. Oliver gasped, his body going limp. And for the first time in weeks, the house fell silent. Claire clutched Oliver against her chest, sobbing. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps. Mercer stood, his expression grim. This isn't over, he murmured. But for now, the thing was gone. For now, the house was quiet, too quiet. Claire sat on the couch, Oliver wrapped tightly in her arms. His breathing was soft now, slow and steady, as if the past few weeks had been nothing more than a bad dream. But she knew better. Daniel stood near the window, his arms crossed, his face tight with exhaustion. His eyes kept flicking to Mercer, who was methodically cleaning up the remnants of the ritual, gathering the broken wax from the candles, closing the ancient book, muttering under his breath as he traced a symbol into the wood of his desk. Brutus hadn't moved from his position in front of Claire and Oliver, his ears flicking at every small noise. He had fought for Oliver, stood guard when they hadn't known they needed it. And now, for the first time, Brutus relaxed. The air in the room had changed. The heavy, suffocating weight was gone. It was subtle, but Claire could feel it. The way the light seemed a little warmer. The way she could breathe without feeling like something was pressing on her lungs. It's gone, she whispered, as if saying it aloud would shatter the fragile peace. Mercer sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. For now. Daniel turned sharply. What the hell does that mean? Mercer met his gaze, unwavering. These things don't just disappear. Whatever haunted your son, whatever marked him, was tied to a deal, a debt. Claire's grip on Oliver tightened. So, we're not safe? Mercer shook his head. You broke its hold for now. But if there's still unfinished business, it will try again. Silence fell over them. The weight of his words pressed deep into Claire's bones. Daniel exhaled sharply, his hands curling into fists. So what do we do? Just live in fear, waiting for it to come back? Mercer closed the book with a thud. You find out where this started. Claire's mouth felt dry. How? Mercer sat across from them, his expression dark. These entities don't just pick random people. They follow bloodlines. If Oliver was marked, it means someone in your family made a deal, and until that debt is settled, it'll keep coming. Daniel let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. Great. So now we have to dig through our family history and find some long-lost secret. Mercer didn't smile. Yes. Claire swallowed hard. She had never cared much for the past. Family trees, ancestry, all of it had always seemed like distant history. But now, the past was alive. It was chasing them. And it wanted their son. Oliver stirred in her arms, his tiny fingers curling into her sweater. She pressed a kiss to his forehead, closing her eyes. "We'll find out," she murmured. "Whatever it takes, we'll find out." Mercer studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Good." He stood, grabbing his coat. "Stay somewhere else tonight. Let the house breathe. I'll cleanse it once more, but I suggest you don't go back until you know exactly what you're dealing with." Claire met Daniel's gaze. "We're not going back." Daniel nodded. "Not until we fix this." Mercer sighed. "Good, because next time it won't let go so easily." 1 week later, they didn't go back to the house, not yet. They stayed in a rental cabin outside of town, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. Claire spent the days making phone calls, digging through old family records, tracing the lines of their history as far back as she could. It was Daniel who found it first. An old newspaper article from 1892, a small story buried in the back pages of a historical archive, but the name leapt out at them like a ghost rising from the past. Wealthy landowner Theodore Holloway found dead in his home. His family refused to comment, but locals believe the Holloways were cursed after Theodore was rumored to have made a deal with a shadow man. His son, Joseph Holloway, vanished weeks later, never to be found. Claire's breath hitched as she read the words aloud. Shadowman. Oliver's bloodline. The debt. Her hands trembled as she put the paper down. She turned to Daniel, her throat tight. This started over a century ago. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tight. And it never ended. Oliver sat on the couch, playing quietly with his stuffed bear. He didn't know, couldn't know, but the past was clawing toward him nonetheless. Claire took a shaky breath. "We have to stop this. We have to find a way to end it." Daniel nodded. "And we will." But as the sun set, as the shadows stretched long across the floor, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting. The past had found them, and it wasn't done yet. The past never truly stays buried. The Holloways thought they had built a life of luxury and security, but some debts are never forgotten. Now Claire and Daniel must uncover the truth before the entity returns, before it claims what it was promised. What would you do if your family's darkest secret came back to haunt you? Would you face it, or would you run? If this story kept you on edge, let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next chilling tale. Stay safe and stay aware.